Welcome to this episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am delighted to be here today with Hope Edelman. Hope is a New York Times bestselling author of 8 books, a grief coach and a creative writing coach. And I feel very, very honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tara. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I like to start with asking everybody what your definition of grief is.
It's such a good question. I wrote a book recently called The After Grief. So I think the best way I can answer this question is to distinguish between how I think of grief and how I think of the after grief. I think of grief as that acute, fresh phase of distress and adjustment and growth after somebody dies, or we have a major loss in our life, because we can grieve a divorce, the loss of a job, the loss of a home, all of that. So after any loss, significant loss or loss that's significant to us. And we know what it feels like in our bodies. It's different for everyone. So I can't tell you what your body feels like. I can tell you what mine feels like. My stomach clenches. I lose my appetite. I have trouble sleeping. My heartbeat races sometimes. I'm sad, deeply sad. So there's somatic responses, there's emotional responses. We might cry a lot. We might be ruminating, intellectually thinking through what happened, trying to make sense of the loss to create a story that feels complete, that we can carry forward until it changes, as it often does. All of that I think of as grief. And it lasts for a different amount of time for everybody, a different amount of time, depending on what you've lost and how attached you were to it and how big the adjustment is that you need to make to live without it. So people say to me, how long does grief last? It could be a month. It could be 6 months. It could be 2 years, that really acute, fresh phase. If it goes on and on to a point where we can't function in our daily lives, we might be experiencing what's called complicated grief. And then it's really important to get professional assistance to work our way through that. But at some point, and anyone who's experienced a major loss knows when it happens. And again, it's different for everybody and it happens in different ways. It might be that there's the first morning where you wake up and it's not the first thing you think of, or the first time you laugh again without feeling guilty about it. I think of that as the beginning of the after grief. And it can be a distinct transition or it can be a gradual one. But the after grief to me is the whole next phase of our life without that person or that home or that job in it. And it is a series of continual adjustments. And we may experience what are called grief spikes, where, something just blindsides us unexpectedly, or we reach a birthday or a holiday or a Mother's or Father's Day, for example, or an anniversary that would have been a celebration. And we experience a grief reaction. Again, it's temporary. It's not as disabling as the first one, usually. And then we move on. So that's the difference, I think, between grief and the after grief. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. And going to your first book, Motherless Daughters, which has helped so many people, including myself. And now you've created, quite a worldwide community. So would you share a little bit more with us about how that happened and how it's going?
Oh gosh, well, the fast forward version of that is I was 17 when my mother died of breast cancer, and I went looking for a book for girls like me because I was a reader and already an aspiring writer, and I couldn't find that book, and I looked for it for quite a long time, about 10 years. And I was in a graduate writing program at that point and decided to try to write it myself. And that became the book, my first book, Motherless Daughters, which was published in 1994 and has been revised twice since. So now it's been out for 27 years, which is kind of remarkable. But when the book first came out, there was a groundswell of attention because there were so many women out there who had lost moms when they were children and teenagers and young adults, who had never seen themselves in the pages of a book before and were eager to meet other women like them. So I was living in New York City at the time and got together with a group of very committed women, and we created an organization. This is all before the internet, and right before the internet, like on the cusp of the internet. It was like 1995, 1996. And we helped women start support groups all over the world. And some of them are still ongoing today. The one in Los Angeles held a luncheon in 1996 and has held one every single year since then. And I believe Detroit as well. There are groups in the UK, but now there are lots of online groups too. There's a lot of Facebook groups. I think there's a couple on Pinterest or Reddit, or some of the platforms I don't use. There's a number on Instagram of people you can follow, and Twitter. And but I have been sort of like loosely overseeing all of the Motherless Daughters groups. At motherlessdaughters.com. There's a list of them so people can see if there's one near them or look for online groups. And also I run online courses and free live events and retreats and workshops. I was doing them in person before COVID, and we will get back to that.
You obviously, in a sense, grieved quite consciously for your mother, because you sort of went out to find people to connect with and did a deep dive. And my experience was not so conscious. I sort of packed all my grief away and sort of ran away from it until I couldn't really run anymore. But so I really, really relate to the concept of the after grief, because it sort of came so much longer after my parents had died. And I just would love to hear about why you think we are such a grief illiterate culture.
Well, I want to dial back just for a second and say I did not grieve consciously at first. In fact, for the first 7 years, I acted like this was no big deal because my family never talked about the death of my mother. And that was pretty typical for the 1980s. There was no grief support. There was no awareness of even how grief worked or what it was, or there was this idea that it happened in 5 stages because Kubler-Ross's book had come out in 1969. So it took 7 years before it really came and hit me on the side of the head and said, oh, you need to deal with me. Hello, hello. I was engaged to be married, and I had ended the engagement, and the grief over that brought up all that, subterranean grief that I had been suppressing. And it was overwhelming to be grieving the loss of this man that I'd loved and my mother at the same time. So that was the first time I went to therapy. I was 24. And then I started writing Motherless Daughters when I was 27 or 28, started talking with other women. And for me, that was the most healing experience, to discover there were other women out there like me. And I'm so deep into that story, I forgot what your question was, Tara, but I'd like to answer it.
Yeah. Why do you think there's such a grief illiterate culture? Or have been?
Well, I think we were derailed a bit, actually, for most of the 20th century. And if I can just do a fast summary of what happened to us, because we went a long, like Edward Albee says, we went a long way we went a long distance out of the way in order to come back a short distance correctly, which has been happening, I think, since the 1990s. But between the 19-teens and the 1990s, a solid 80 years, I think that Western culture got really derailed with grief theory. And if we think about the 19th century, like the Victorian era, the Romantics, they were very much in touch with their grief. They had elaborate and intricate rituals for mourning the death of a loved one. It was a very social experience, and it was a highly emotional experience. In fact, the Romantics believed that if you did not outwardly show your distress, then perhaps you had not really loved or been attached to the person who died. But a couple of things happened in the 19-teens in fast succession that changed all that. Grief theory changed and mourning behavior changed. And in my opinion, it was not for the better, though I imagine there are others who would disagree, especially owners of corporations. But the first thing that happened was World War I, when we had mass casualties happening great distances from the home. So large numbers of people were dying far from home and buried on the battlefield where they fell. So families could not bury their dead at home and go through the rituals the way that they had always understood. Then Sigmund Freud wrote a paper in 1917 called Mourning and Melancholia that described mourning as a very individual interior process that happened in a series of stages. And that was the beginning of thinking of grief as very linear in an intellectual way. So the psychoanalysts grabbed that idea and ran with it, even though about 10 years later, Freud said, you know what, actually, I'm grieving my daughter and my grandson, and that's not exactly how it's working for me. The third thing that happened was, fascinatingly enough, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-19. 50 million people died around the world. Mm-hmm. And the number of casualties was so high that it changed mourning behavior, and mourning periods truncated, funerals became smaller and less elaborate because people couldn't afford the expense or the time to mourn that many loved ones. And you know, it was horrific to lose so many people in World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic just between 1914 and 1919. I mean, these were mass casualties. And I think it just really affected the way that people responded to loss and death. And there was probably a lot of existential crises going on around that, because we lost a lot of the rituals and practices that we had come to depend on. The fourth thing that happened was, and this is from the work of Tony Walter, who's a British sociologist and historian, women's suffrage, because the mourning rituals of the Victorian era fell mainly on the middle class and upper class women in society, to make sure that the home was decorated properly and the social rules were followed and that dress was accordingly, you know, prepared. And they rose up against that and said, you know, this is really inequitable. Men get to go to work wearing a black armband, but we have to dress head to toe in black for a year and can't, you know, go out in the world the way we used to. It's our responsibility, you know, to shoulder that for the family. So those four things created a shift in grief theory and mourning behavior, where we started having much shorter mourning periods. We reduced and there actually was a fifth thing, which is that death moved from the home to the hospital. That was really important, actually. It became institutionalized. And that's part of how we became what you called grief-illiterate, because death used to happen in the home. People died at home, they laid in state at home, and then the bodies were prepared for burial by the family. All of this got outsourced to hospitals and funeral homes. And so people weren't living in a climate where it was normal for those to die and for us to take care of them and for the family to do the rituals. So it was removed from the home and the family. And that's a big part. So that's the fifth thing. That's a big part of how our culture started changing. And then once we started thinking of grief as an interior and progressive experience, we collided with the modern era, which was all about efficiency and progress. So it was a perfect theory for the times. Mm-hmm. And corporations then were all about getting people, and companies were all about getting people back into the workforce, which is how in the US we wind up with 3 days of paid bereavement leave after somebody dies. That's the average. 3 days. That's not even enough time to hold a funeral in some cultures or religions. And that all culminated in the 5 stages of grief with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And it wasn't until really the 1990s that we saw the next big shift in grief theory, which was, hey, wait a second, that's not how it's happening. Therapists started noticing among their clients that this is not how people were describing their experiences, that people were describing their grief and their mourning more like in a cyclical way. And they were also, instead of breaking their ties to the ones who had died and getting over it or moving on or reaching a state of resolution or closure or acceptance, they were very much looking for, and in many cases, finding ways to carry their loved ones forward. And so that was the next big shift in the 1990s. But we really got derailed for about 80 years. Very long answer to your question, but I didn't want to short shrift it because I think it's really important for us to understand the context of where we are now.
No, I love your answer, but I also kind of wanted you to share, because I know that when you were writing After Grief, you didn't know that we were about to hit a pandemic.
I had no idea. And so I went down the rabbit hole of the Spanish flu pandemic for about 2 weeks, reading everything I could find, because I was so fascinated by the impact that it had on culture. Right. So then when we wind up in the next big worldwide pandemic, at the beginning of 2020 or the end of 2019, but in the US, the spring of 2020, I could see the parallels. And I could see that all of, 100 years of technology and a virus still operates the same way and is still going to be controlled ultimately, with the exception of vaccines, which we didn't have in 1919, but masking up, social distancing, quarantining, all of that, washing hands, all of that is exactly what people were being encouraged to do 100 years ago.
I know, it's so interesting, the timing for you.
Yeah.
So interesting. And I wonder now whether it feels that there's another awakening happening now about grief, and just so many conversations happening and so much more awareness, which is amazing.
Yes, absolutely. I think we were already getting there. Very interesting. Yeah, we were already starting to get there. I was in London in, I think it was spring of 2018, and did a one-day symposium in London about mother loss and motherless daughters, and the BBC covered it. And I was already noticing a big shift happening in Britain. And the people that I spoke with there, the grief professionals, said that it was in large part because of the princes talking about their ongoing distress around the death of their mom on the 20th anniversary of her death, which was 2017. Yes, it was 2017. And so there was more conversation opening up around that. So when Motherless Daughters came out in 1994, I couldn't give it away in the UK. I mean, it came out in the UK, but it was just reissued actually in 2018, because there's now so much more conversation around there. So you all in the UK are outpacing us in the US now. You're ahead of the game with talking and becoming more open about grief, I think, in a public way. And you have fantastic charities and trusts there at a national level. Here in the US, a lot of what goes on is local. And we do have a number of fantastic bereavement centers, and that helps an awful lot here. But those started opening in the 1990s again here. And, when my mom died in 1981, there were no grief centers. There wasn't even hospice in our community. So people couldn't die at home. Hospice brought death back into the home. And I think that's been a good thing for the culture as well.
Absolutely.
And the dying, first and foremost.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a relationship between unresolved grief and depression?
I'm going to unpack that. Yeah. I think that grief and depression look an awful lot alike and are often confused. And this is what Freud attempted to write about in 1917. His paper, Mourning and Melancholia meaning what we now call depression, was intended to distinguish between the two, because he noticed differences among his patients. And I don't know how to describe unresolved grief, because it's a term that gets applied to so many types of grief. And I think it's more in the eye of the beholder than in the experience of the mourner, unresolved grief, because it's a label that's applied to someone who looks like they're not resolving their grief. But then we have to think about, well, what does it mean to resolve your grief? I mean, I think it means to integrate it to the best of your ability at any point in time. But later on, you're going to reach a life milestone, or you're going to get new information about what happened that might create that grief spike. And that I think of as a completely normative experience, even if it happens 20 years later. But someone else could look and say, my God, you're not over it yet. Clearly, your grief is unresolved. So I think there's confusion in between grief and depression, not just in the general populace, but sometimes among professionals. I mean, I talk with OBGYN sometimes right now, and I say, if a woman is coming to you who looks like she has postpartum depression, please check her medical chart and see if her mother died, because she might be having a grief response and it may look very much the same. And you can treat her for depression and it might lift her mood, but it will not address the core issue, which is that she is really missing her mom now that she's become a mom herself.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think, I don't know, personally, I think that maybe a lot of I had like a lot of repressed grief inside of me, and I didn't know how to express it and move it, and it resulted in sort of more of a milder depression. But it's
Yes.
something that I feel that we're talking a lot about grief in relation to death, but there's so many times in our lives where grief comes up, and because we're sort of so pain avoidant, you know, we just kind of want to do anything to get away from the feelings sometimes.
Absolutely. You know, grief that is congested or unexpressed, I talk about unexpressed grief, or unattended to, can go inside, you know, can turn inward and, you know, create depression, or it can be externalized sometimes as anger or violence.
Yes.
And you are absolutely right about that. You know, I am preparing right now to sell the family house of 23 years. And I'm going to try not to tear up. It is breaking my heart. And right now I feel like I'm in a phase of anticipatory grief because we're getting, you know, we're doing everything to move in that direction. And it is very much, you know, a straight arrow heading that way. But I live in a fire zone, you know, and I have friends in Malibu whose homes have burned down. And I think of that as the difference between a sudden loss and anticipatory grief, because there is, I am very much feeling grief around having to sell the house. And so it's not just because of a loss, you know, we grieve the end of a relationship. We grieve the loss of a job or an identity. Yes, grief is not an experience that we have just when someone dies. It is often most profound when someone dies, because that is a living person, you know, who we can no longer exist within the physical world, perhaps someone that we were dependent on, and we don't know where to put that love after that. You know, we may find a place to put the energy from a job. We may find another place that will feel like home again, but a person is irreplaceable. You know, an individual person is irreplaceable. So, but yes, you're correct. We can grieve lots of things. And right now, you know, during the pandemic era, we are grieving a whole way of life that may or may not come back as it was before. You know, parts of it we may lose forever. Parts of it may come back differently. Parts of it may be replaced. But we don't know when also. So we're, in addition to all of the, you know, having to adjust to a new way of life, we're trying to cope with uncertainty at the same time. I mean, this is on the one hand, this is a really, really difficult time to be alive. On the other hand, it's an extraordinary time to be here because it happens only once every 100 years, apparently.
Yeah, it is. It is an extraordinary time, like you're saying. I just had friends of mine in Hong Kong posting pictures of her children, you know, and she said that it was them dressing up in their back to school, you know, but they're not at school and they're having scary tests the whole time, and just reminiscing on what an extraordinary time this is that we'll all look back on, and we don't know what the effects are going to be on children just yet, but it's definitely extremely memorable. Yeah,
it is. You know, the pandemic started, my youngest was a senior in high school. And so what that meant was that for the last semester of her high school experience, she could not be with her friends, have a prom or a graduation. And it started university, you know, without being able to go to class. It is, her college is now talking about going back to in-class learning this fall. So it might create some sense of what we would think of as normality, but it will still be different. You know, movie theaters just opened up here in California, where I live, at 20% capacity, something like that, 25% capacity. So yeah, we're going to be in a liminal transitional phase for a while, and we don't know where it's going to end up. You know, that kind of uncertainty is disorienting for many. And we are mourning, you know, a lot of what we lost, and some things that we can't get back.
Absolutely. And what would you say conscious grief looks like?
Well, Tara, this is your term. Why don't you tell me what conscious grief means to you? And then I'll tell you, I'll riff off of that.
I would say that from my experience, I really was so out of touch with my feelings. And I just did not want to, I did everything to run from all the negativity, and I did everything to be sort of strong and put on a brave face and not feel. And I had a very sort of negative view on life for a long time as a result of that, and not a very full experience of my life. And so when I finally got to this stage where I learned what was going on inside of me and how to express it, how to nurture myself, how to acknowledge, what had happened to me as a really big thing, as opposed to just not wanting it to sort of be part of my reality, I suppose. And so I was very unconsciously dealing with it, but it was cropping up, now I see, in my life and causing difficulties. And so for me, it would be really around being in a place where you can express yourself, and with people that you can express yourself. So when you talk about your communities, that for me feels like really conscious grieving.
Okay, so I'll work off of that, because I agree with you completely. I would define conscious grieving as recognizing and naming what you're feeling as grief and giving yourself permission to express it. Yeah. And part of that is finding people that can hold that space for you to do that without trying to put a positive spin on it or push it back down or be critical or judgmental.
Absolutely.
And yes, you're right. At the Motherless Daughters retreats that I lead, we sit in a circle. There's 26 women, and we all give ourselves permission to explore our grief. Some people recognized and named it long ago, but have reached a point in their life where they need to, revise and rework some of it and reframe it. Some people maybe have never talked about it before and are coming to do that for the first time. So it's all over the map, but everyone gives every member of the group permission to express their grief in whatever way is going to be most meaningful and helpful to them, and support them in doing that. It's an extraordinary 4 days. I can't wait to get back to doing it in person, because this cannot be replicated online. It's 3 nights, and we live together. We, eat together. We brush our teeth next to each other in the morning. It's sort of like joining a sorority for 4 days, and sharing our stories. And people say to me, "Oh my gosh, that must be such a sad couple of days." And I say, actually, there's a tremendous amount of laughter that occurs, because these women share the same dark humor. And we don't spend all the time talking about mother loss. There's plenty of time off. There's 3 hours off per day. And we have meal times and sitting around at night, just talking and discovering what else we have in common that may not even be related to mother loss. And then you leave, and there's 25 other women who you stay in touch with. And these groups are continuing to have reunions, staying in touch online. And now they have the support network that perhaps they didn't have before, for being able to express and share and receive support around their grief when it comes up. Online, someone might post, "Tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of my mom's death, and I'm feeling a little down," and they'll get 17 comments immediately of support, which is something that they may not have had before. They may not have even felt safe sharing that publicly before, because they would have anticipated judgment as a result.
Well, I can't wait to come on one of your retreats. And my last question, because I know we're getting to time, would be, what do you believe are the gifts of grief?
In the after grief, I talk in the epilogue about what I call the missing elements of grief. And we typically don't recognize them right away. It takes time, to see how your adjustment is going to unfold, because any adverse event sets into motion a chain of events that lead to other outcomes. And some of them might be really positive. If I trace in my life, I can actually say that my 2 daughters exist because my mother died when I was 17, because that led me to write a book, which led me to start an organization, which led me to rent office space, which led me to sublease from a man who I started dating and then married and had 2 children with. So that's not to say in any way that I'm grateful for my mother dying. I can hold two truths side by side, which is that I'm really sad that my mom died so young. She was only 42, and that she hasn't been here all these years. And I'm so sad for all she lost and that I lost as a result as her daughter, and wish that she had lived. And I'm grateful for my daughter's existence because they're the lights of my life. Both of those things can be true at the same time. I think that over time, many people experience, and I've heard this from almost everyone I interviewed for the after grief, a renewed sense of appreciation for just their own existence and being here, and this gratitude for the small things in life, a sense of mystery and wonder and awe, which is, the existential experience of, realizing life is fragile and it's a gift to be here. There may be humility, and there's many gifts that can come as a result of grief. But what I want to emphasize to anyone watching this is that is not my attempt to put a positive spin on loss. I'm very much about saying a sad thing happened. It was tragic. We can acknowledge that. And at the same time, we can carry these gifts that were given to us as a result, or that we sought out as a result of loss. There's a field of, or an area of psychology called post-traumatic growth, which looks at how people personally grow as a result of being exposed to trauma or adversity, like the death of a loved one or a major loss. And we can use that loss, or that loss can become a springboard for personal growth. But again, this is not something we typically see right away. It's kind of the long view. It's an after grief experience.
Wow, I hadn't heard that. I'm going to look that up. Amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I just have loved talking to you. Have so much to share. And your book is now available in the UK, the new
Yes, it is.
After Grief. So I just want to reiterate that to everybody that's watching and listening. And I know that it's an incredible book. So thank you very much again, Hope.
You're very, very welcome, Tara. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for all the work you do.